This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
Can you tell me, what is a Chinese medicine doctor?
Chinese medicine obviously is a very old form of medicine. It's been around for a really long time and has had outstanding results.
So let's have a conversation about contraception in general, but the oral contraceptive pill in particular, and women going on it before they're sexually mature.
One of the most fascinating things I learned in writing this book is that, a young girl's hormones don't really find their way until around 18.
Why do you think that we're so scared to tell our young women and our children about normal physiology and how things work?
I feel like at some point the conversation changed and became inappropriate.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? Welcome to the Expert Series, where you'll meet 25 of the world leaders in health and wellness, discussing their passions and what it takes to make your shift.
There's an electrical feeling in the room.
I had to be a mom. It was so important to me.
I've always been a pain in the butt, and I love that.
I knew that I wanted to help people.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. Hi, I'm Katherine Maslen, naturopath, author and host of The Shift. In the Expert Series, we share the insights, stories and expertise of each of our amazing experts. You might have met them on season 1 of The Shift, where we took snippets of these conversations and put them together into the series. If you haven't listened to season 1 yet, I'd recommend going back and listening to episode 1 on what it takes to make a shift in your gut health. We'll provide a link in the show notes. In this episode of the Expert Series, we have Nat Kringoudis. Nat is a doctor of Chinese medicine, an acupuncturist, author, speaker, and natural fertility specialist. Nat is the author of 2 amazing books, Well and Good, and her recently released book, Beautifully You, which is a much-needed guide for young women to understand their bodies and their hormones. Nat says she makes hormones happier than a Pharrell Williams song and helps women to balance their hormones so that they can balance their life. What I love about Nat is the way that she is such a crusader for empowering women to really understand their bodies and to take control of their hormonal health. She is the co-host of 2 fantastic podcasts, the Wellness Collective radio show and The Period Party, as well as being a regular media advocate and passionate speaker on all things women's health. Some of Nat's story was shared in episode 16 of season 1 of The Shift, and you'll hear more of it here. We talk about the unknown effects of the oral contraceptive pill, how acupuncture really works, and her remarkable story of how she navigated her son's diagnosis of cystic fibrosis and how this helped to shape her philosophy on health today. Let's get stuck right into it.
My name's Nat Kringoudis. I'm a doctor of Chinese medicine and women's health expert, and I'm also a 4 times best-selling author. And I really just love to help women sort their hormones out.
Wonderful. I love it. So I want to definitely talk about the books and get into all of that type of thing. Where were you born?
I was born in country Victoria in Mildura.
And where did you go to primary school?
I went to primary school at the local Lutheran primary, which I hated because there were 35 students in total. And now it's a massive school. Now it goes right through to year 12. But 35 students, that was my normal. It was rather hippie, really, when you think about it. But it was a lot of pressure when it came to friends. And whilst the education was amazing, I can't say I had a great experience.
And what happened after you finished primary school?
Then I went to the large Catholic school in Mildura. There weren't many schools. And I thought when I finished school I wanted to study music. It's a really funny story, actually. In year 10, I had my English teacher tell me never to be a writer, that I was really awful at writing. And I remember thinking at the time, you have no idea what you're talking about. I'm an awesome writer.
And clearly you've proven her right.
I would love to send her some books, actually. But I also had my music teacher say to me, don't apply to VCA, you're not good enough.
Wow.
And I really believed her. I really felt like my music wasn't good enough. And I did a lot of performing and acting and whatever through high school. So I didn't apply, and what's interesting is just how, if there's this slight insecurity, how you can really let that become something. And I really did. But the English teacher, I was like, you don't even know what you're talking about. I'm awesome at this. So it was really funny that I got told two things that I couldn't do, and one of them I believed and one of them I didn't. Anyway, so I didn't go on. I went initially studied biosciences, so I did health science, biosciences. So I did 3 years of that, and then studied herbal medicine, and then studied acupuncture. But I opened up the clinic in between those last 2 degrees. So it was a sort of 10.5-year professional student.
What made you choose natural therapies?
Well, I grew up with natural medicine in the family. It was kind of innate. Funny story though, when I first applied and got accepted, I rocked up to my first day on campus and thought I was studying naturopathy, and it was actually Chinese herbal medicine. And I was like, oh well, if that's not a sign, I don't know what is, so we're going to do this. It was challenging at first. There weren't a lot of people that were kind of like me. I didn't feel like there was, I just felt like a bit of an outsider, and eventually found a buddy who, I actually ended up opening a clinic with, so that was really cool. But it was a very different world from what I knew at La Trobe, so yeah.
What is a Chinese medicine doctor?
That's a really good question, because there are, like any medical profession or expert, there's so many variations of what shapes that person, and it comes down to a personal approach. Chinese medicine obviously is a very old form of medicine. It's been around for a really long time and has had outstanding results because it looks at the body as a whole operational system, not just a system on its own. And so it probably has stood the test of time for that reason. It can look at the body and treat more the root cause rather than all the symptoms that lie around it. So as a practitioner, I'm an acupuncturist, I'm a herbalist, and I integrate, I guess, Eastern wisdom into modern day appropriate treatments. And I think that's where my strengths probably lie, and I've been doing that for a long time because I recognise that what I was taught at university wasn't what I was seeing come into the clinic. And so I had to very quickly bring things up to speed to be relative and relevant to what we were seeing in modern day problems. So yeah, that's the basis of it though. I do a lot of acupuncture, and we do use a lot of herbal medicine and supplements. When I say a lot, I'm very less is more. I try to use the least amount possible to get the most profound change.
Oh, fantastic. So what is Eastern philosophy, and how is it different to kind of what we know in the West?
Yeah, so when we look at the body from a Chinese medicine perspective, we very much appreciate that the organs have what we call meridians, or channels that run from each of them, either down the arm or down the leg, and various points along those channels will influence the way that the organ behaves. So that's where acupuncture really excels, and it will use, tiny needles, as you've probably seen, to influence how you can, if something's overactive, you can kind of calm it down. If something's not working properly, you can tonify it and support it to work better. So that's acupuncture. And then herbal medicine uses a similar principle in terms of looking at the way we would diagnose and integrate the organ systems, but obviously using herbal medicine to do that, not so much acupuncture needles to do that. So, this philosophy, there's various schools of thought. There's not one philosophy when it comes to Chinese or Eastern medicine. It depends on when you were taught at school, you tend to gravitate towards a certain era and what they were or how they were categorising illness at that time that makes sense to you. So I'm very much from what we would call the spleen stomach school almost, where the gut was the epicenter of the body as we know now. And that's probably why it drew me in so much, was because it made so much sense to me. And this is, more than 20 years ago when I was learning this, that one day my lecturer said, the spleen is the epicenter of your health. And I was like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense. When we're talking about the spleen and stomach in Chinese medicine, that translates to the gut, just to be clear. So that made a lot of sense. But there's other schools of thought. There's schools about cold illness and hot illness. There's all sorts. So it's such a massive area. It's very intricate, but yet basic at the same time. And that's probably why I love it so much.
So tell me, is there much research on Chinese medicine?
What I'm loving now is finally there is research going into Chinese medicine. There hasn't been a lot to date. And so I think there are definitely acupuncture points now that are being researched. My understanding is that there was a fairly large study done on a really common acupuncture point, stomach 36, which is in the leg. And it was shown and proven to reduce all inflammation in the body. Yeah, which was really exciting because it just really validated what we've been using it for for a really long time, but also makes me think, well, if that's just one point and they can prove that, it does this via the vagus nerve, communicates with the brain, imagine what they're going to find out when they research more acupuncture points. So that was really exciting. And then, of course, herbal medicine, I guess, has a little bit more research behind it, although I'm led to believe in the last lot of research that I did when I was creating some product, there wasn't actually any one herb that had been studied in depth in Chinese medicine from a perspective of Chinese medicine. So we might study, like you said before, something we might study in the West and believe it to have a certain action is going to be different than the action we might say that it has in Chinese medicine. It makes it really hard to actually research and validate. So I guess, again, for us, the proof's there when we treat patients and they recover and they get better against what you would consider maybe the odds. But when you've used something over and over and over again, you get the same outcome. There's merit to it, obviously.
And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we don't treat patients with one herb, and specifically in Chinese medicine, you would never prescribe one herb. It would always be a formula. So a lot of the research are based on formulas, which I think is really valid. That's the way that they're used, and that's that holistic approach. And I guess there's a lot of stuff in the media at the moment, with medical and health fund rebates in question, etc. But the interesting thing is the pool of research, there's stuff there, there's evidence, but it's interesting how much pushback there is from the medical community about herbal medicine and things like that, when there's actually, quite a big body of evidence that they're really effective.
Yeah, I think it's only a matter of time. I spent a lot of time in America with some pretty advanced medical professionals as well as complementary medical professionals, and they're so progressive, many of them, not all of them, of course, but are so progressive in how even integrating therapies and all working together, and the how valid this, some of these herbal medicines are. It's very interesting.
And how are they different? Like, what have you observed when you were there?
I think that they're more open to the possibility that medicine doesn't have all the answers. We know it doesn't, yet I think it's a very different world, I guess. And I unfortunately was in the ER, not personally, but visiting a relative over Christmas, and just the way that that whole operation works, it's very easy to get caught up in that swirl, and it can become quite a spiral. So I guess being able to step back and actually look at the bigger picture, I think that's part of what they're doing, and realising that if it's not life or death, what other approaches could we look at that are going to possibly have less side effects, that are going to be, if not as effective, maybe more effective in the long term, and sustainable too. So I just find that there are a lot of people that are quite progressive, that do understand the power of the collaboration, especially when it comes to someone's health and their medical team, I guess, or I call it the cheer squad, but those professionals that are on your side, that are totally there cheering you on.
From working with thousands of patients, I know that learning doesn't always equate to doing. For some of you, I know that you'll listen and take action right away, but for others, you're going to need a little more help. That's why I've developed my Gut Shift program. Over 12 weeks, I'll take you through what you need to make a shift in your gut health step by step. It's based on the latest clinical research combined with the clinical experience from seeing thousands of patients. Registrations are now open. Go to theshiftclinic.com and click on Shift with Us.
The Shift!
One of the things I'm really passionate about is just changing this perception on triaging when it comes to health, rather than people going to a doctor as a first line, actually working on balancing their body and improving that, because everything has got their place. But certainly I think a lot of people are seeking help because they're imbalanced. They don't have a disease per se. They don't have a treatable or severe disease, but it's something that's severely impacting the quality of their life. How do you see that playing out in your practice?
Yeah, I think that we have been conditioned to go to the worst case scenario and work backwards, and we wait it out whilst we've done that. So let's use endometriosis as an example. Possibly suspected you have endo, not going to know until you have a laparoscopy, although there is new tests coming through, but they're not quite there yet. So you wait it out. And if you're in the public system, you might wait for 4 months to get that. So it's this waiting game that you sit, and each month you're in as much pain as you were the last month because you haven't done anything different. You just hope that it's going to be a better month and wait for your laparoscopy. And I see this often in the clinic. Patients will say, or people will ring up, they're not necessarily patients, but they'll call up and they'll say, oh, I've got a laparoscopy booked for May. I'd like to make an appointment for when after I've had the laparoscopy so we can start to treat it. And I'm like, no, you start now. Let's treat this now, because maybe you don't need the laparoscopy. 4 months is a long time to make some progress. So, and even if you don't get to where you were hoping to, whether that's pain-free and no evidence of any problem, you are still optimising the function of the body in the meanwhile. So your recovery from your surgery is potentially going to be better. Your quality of life, certainly. I mean, most people that have some type of inflammatory condition change a few basic things and they get better fairly quickly. So that's one example that I see that happens often. But it's a shotgun approach. It's, oh my goodness, this is so bad. This is happening to me. I need to get this removed immediately. And so often we're only removing evidence of the problem and not actually treating the condition itself. So I would really, with patients, I encourage them to get in as soon as possible and we get the ball rolling.
I'd like to get into your story a bit more, your health story, if that's okay. So tell me, when was the first time that you experienced a health issue where something became apparent for you?
I was raised in a family that was super healthy to the point where it used to be embarrassing because it just so wasn't cool as a little girl and then as a teenager. So I never knew really what health challenges were, I guess, until I was older. Having said that, I was the child I was an asthmatic and I was in hospital a lot and had a lot of medications as a really young child. So part of mum swinging the other way was when she realised that the medical profession wasn't actually helping as such, long term anyway. So that was probably my first experience. It was I remember being in hospital as an 8-year-old with pneumonia. It was awful. And that's, I think, when things changed pretty quickly after that. I didn't know period pain. I didn't know any of these challenges until I moved away from home. And I all of a sudden had this amazing freedom and a Kentucky Fried Chicken around the corner, which was pretty much my lunch most days of the week because those zinger wraps were pretty delicious for someone who'd never had them before. And so I didn't realise, but I started to gain weight fairly quickly, and my periods, they were fairly awful all of a sudden, and I just didn't feel good. And so I probably lived like that for a few years before I realised that something had to change. I wanted to lose weight. It had nothing to do with my period or my eczema or any of the other things I was experiencing, and pretty quickly things did improve. So I guess that was my first experience with how, what I put into my body and movement really influenced the way that my body behaved. It wasn't really until I became a mum that I really knew what illness was when Geordie was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. So he's 7 now, but that was without doubt the biggest challenge I've ever had to live through. He was diagnosed when he was 4 weeks old. So you've got this brand new teeny tiny baby, and that was a whirlwind just in terms of, getting this phone call from the Children's Hospital saying, "How's your Christmas?" And I said, "Fine. Why are you asking me?" And she said, "Oh, well," then she explained Geordie had shown up positive to CF. We were then ushered into the hospital for what I call CF boot camp, which was sort of 4.5 days of really intense information and learning about CF, learning about what his needs would be. And this is not their fault, and this is just, again, speaking about the difference between the medical model and complementary medicine. But it was this whole fear-based and worst-case scenario approach that your life has changed, things are very different now, this is very serious. If you don't do what you're told to do, you're basically going to be in a lot of trouble, and he was going to have a lot of challenges. But, the research that was coming through was very positive, and that we could hold on to the hope of them finding what they call a cure for CF. We were sitting with the dietitian, and she at one point alluded to the fact that these kids fail to thrive. So you're faced with this challenge of immune issues, lung problems and digestive issues. And so this dietitian's there telling me that, just feed him McDonald's, and he's 4 weeks old, so he's not at the point where he's eating McDonald's, but alluding to the fact that he's so lucky he can eat whatever he wants, he's not going to gain weight. But at the same time, you need to try and feed them as much as you can. And it was at that point that I was like, I just can't do this today anymore. And I remember saying, all right, I just need to go home. And she looked at me and my husband looked at me, and I'm like, it's time to go home. Like, I can't do this anymore today. No disrespect to you at all. I've had enough for today. We got to the Friday, and it was the day we were going to talk about his regime and what he needed in terms of medications. And I remember on our way in to the hospital turning to my husband, and I just had this feeling come over me. I was like, what happens if we made it okay? And my husband was like, as he often does, because I come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas. He's like, oh, yeah, okay, babe, sure. And I'm like, no, but what happens if it could be okay? And he was like, well, okay, well, I'm sure it's going to be okay, sort of thing. And I'm like, no, but we could make it okay. Like, I feel like this is going to be okay. So we went in there and we sat with the paediatrician. At the time, and I don't know if it's changed, the treatment for Geordie was a 2-year prophylactic dose of antibiotics. And I was just like, this doesn't make any sense. And they're like, well, this is what we want to do to make sure that he doesn't get sick. And I said, but what about his liver? And they were like, well, unfortunately, Nat, in the way that we work, we don't really look at the liver. We just look at his lungs. And I said, and what about his gut? And they're like, again, it's more about his lungs than his gut. And I said, no, it's all about his gut. The lungs are secondary. And I said, look, no disrespect, guys, but we're either going to have to come up with a plan that works for all of us, or with every fibre of my being, what you're asking me to do, I just can't do it. And I'm not prepared to do it. And either we're going to be on the same page and we're going to do this together, or I hate to say it, but I'm just going to lie to you, because, you're going to judge me for not doing what you're asking me to do, yet in the pit of my stomach, I feel sick for what you're asking me to do. His doctor said, okay, what do you want? And I said, I want a year without antibiotics. And he said, you can have 6 months. And I said, great. And he said to me, but if this child gets sick in the next 6 months, basically, he didn't say you're at my mercy, but he alluded to the fact that I'm in charge here. And I said, okay, no problem. So it was really interesting, because from that, there was such a turning point to advocate for what felt right for him as a mum. And, mother's intuition, there's nothing getting in the way of that. And nor should there be. And if you're in a position where you're second-guessing that, it is never wrong, ever, ever wrong. And so, then we went on to have this really lovely conversation about how, the worlds that we live in and the world that they live in are polar opposites. But we wanted to try and integrate them where we thought that was appropriate. And we left that hospital feeling like I had some type of control over the situation once again, and that it was going to be okay. We really started to focus on looking for evidence of health in Geordie, like where could we see health, what was working, and really not dismissing the illness side of it, but just not focusing on it and not really creating much room for it, I guess, and really creating a lot of room for health and well-being. And very quickly what I realised was that the more you looked for evidence of health, the more you found it. And it was just this beautiful snowball effect that just all of a sudden took off. And sure, there were days where he would get sick and I would be like, oh my goodness, what do we do? And there were a couple of times where I was like, we might need to head for the antibiotics. You can't sort of head into 5 or 6 weeks of coughing is a long time for someone with CF. But again, at the same time, he's also human and a child. So what has been so beautiful is that he just turned 7. He's never been medicated. He's never had antibiotics. He's never had any other medication other than his digestive enzymes. We now don't really do anything special, but we did a lot of special things at the beginning. We did a lot of therapies. We did a lot of salt therapy, and I was breastfeeding, so I was on every supplement on the planet. Really set a foundation up, did a few other things that were definitely against the grain for him. And now there's no fear anymore. It's like he just is as he is, and he's amazing. I don't tell this Geordie's story because I think we're amazing or that we've got all the answers. I tell Geordie's story because I think no matter what health challenge that you're faced with, really your mindset is going to set you apart from the rest. And that's really the thing that stood out, I think, with Geordie and that experience was that if I could focus on health, I found it. And I think all too often we focus on illness and therefore we see illness and we create more of that. So it's been such an empowering experience, something that we're so grateful for and something that we've learnt that we just never, ever take our health for granted. And I know that's very cliche, but it's really often not until it looks like it's not going to be there anymore that we start to step up and actually invest in it. And Geordie's an everyday reminder that we have to invest in ours, and that's forever.
That's such a remarkable story, and it's definitely one worth sharing. And it's looking at, you take two different humans and what's going to happen in the trajectory from the very start to kind of get this diagnosis and to have all of that negativity and going, well, this is how it's going to play out. And then for a lot of people, the reality is they take that on and that is how it plays out. And I think it's really sad. And just going back to your personal story around healing, so back to the time when you were eating the KFC and putting on the weight, like what was the turning point for you? What made you realise you needed to do something different?
Like I said, it was nothing to do with my period pain or my eczema. It was all about the fact that I didn't like feeling overweight or feeling yuck. And because I'd felt better prior to that. Probably more about physical appearance. And this is part of the reason in my new book, Beautiful You, that I definitely touch on the physicality for young women, because I think that's often the motivator is, oh, I don't want to have acne anymore, or why am I bloated all the time? I haven't moved my bowels for 6 days. What does that mean? They don't care about excess estrogen necessarily, unless you say, oh, that could be contributing to your anxiety and your weight gain and your period pain, then they might care. But just to present hormones as hormones, let's say, as an example, most teens and most young women, they're not really interested. And again, because it's there more for long-term reproductive health, you're not thinking about most women aren't thinking about having a baby at 16 or 21. So it gets put on the back burner so often. But again, when we come back to treating the body as a whole, it just to fix one and you fix everything if you're treating the root problem. So I think, yeah, we definitely need to speak the language of whoever it is at the time, make it age appropriate. But I think for too long we've spoken to teens as if they are, ready to have babies, and they're not. And they're hard to talk to. I get them in the clinic. They're really hard to talk to. And because also there's varying levels of maturity, I think sort of once we enter the workforce and we've been through university, we're all, have various levels of maturity, but we're kind of on the same page. Whereas that time between, and it depends when you get your period as well as to how quickly you have to grow up. But you could be talking to a range of girls between 13 and 21, I would say, in empowering them in their own sexual and reproductive health. And it's a hard conversation.
So tell me, why did you write your book?
So my previous book to this, Well and Good, was very much aimed at setting women up for happier hormones and for fertility. But I always use the tagline, fertility isn't just about babies, it's about having a thriving reproductive system. Now, I love that tag, and it probably appeals to maybe younger women, but not the reproductive part, because we spend half of our lives trying to not have babies and then deciding when it's time. And all too often I see the women in the clinic who can't have the babies. So I think really starting to open up the conversation, I thought if I could fix these women when they're coming into my clinic and they're 32 and they're desperate for a baby, if I could have fixed them when they were 22 or 18 or 16, that's a completely different conversation. And how can we start to have some information that is age appropriate, that is something that they want to hear, and empowering them from, every step of the way, from when they're tiny and they're asking questions. I actually don't think that there's a wrong time. I think it needs to be age appropriate, but I think we dismiss the crucial conversations when they arise. When, girls are 7, 8, 9, whatever, they're asking how a baby's made, we make up some random ridiculous story and set the foundation that makes it really hard for us to come back from and do a 360 and then actually teach them what actually happens. So I guess there's a few reasons why I wrote it. One, because I wanted to help women fix it before it was broken. And two, because we needed to make the information appropriate for the younger women. And yeah, that's how it was. And also probably because my publisher really wanted it. She had a 15-year-old daughter and she was like, I need this book now. I really, really think that was part of it as well. Right place, right time. But it was without doubt the hardest book that I've written. To speak to 16-year-olds is not easy. And to make sure that it was done in a way that the emotion was removed, but the facts were presented, but it was still warm. I think that's also really important. What I find interesting is that as adults, we've had an experience already, whether it's around sexual or reproductive health, we've got a lot of emotion attached to it. They don't. So when we go to tell, present them with information, say about, I don't know, where did I come from? We get embarrassed about that because there is this emotion attached. To them, it's just physiology.
It's facts.
It's facts, right?
Why do you think that we're so scared to tell our young women and our children about normal physiology and how things work?
I feel like at some point the conversation changed and became inappropriate. And if I think back and I think about my mum and then I think about her mum, I would say that generation, so my grandmother's generation, because, through the pill and then women's liberation and that whole through the 60s and 70s, I feel like rather than women spending a lot of time together solving each other's problems as a community, that was part of the disconnect because we didn't do that anymore. Maybe we turned off reproductive function and a lot of things were pushed under the carpet as such. So I feel like at one point in time, it would have been spoken about all the time. And then somewhere along the line, it just became not okay to talk about. And now we're doing I'm hoping we're going to do another 180 and we're going to start to talk about it. And I have this absolute vision that I just want this book in schools because I think I've written it in such a way that it's factual, there isn't that much emotion attached to it, and it's tasteful, appropriate. Who's deciding? I want to know who's deciding what should and shouldn't be taught to teenagers in school. Other than, to me, it makes no sense that we're holding back a lot of the facts because it is taboo. Or we talk about contraception, but we might be in a religious school that's not allowed to talk about it. It's like, but we're doing it anyway.
Yeah, and there's that conversation around what is important for young people to know. Is it algebra or is it good diet, how their bodies work, how to be in touch with their bodies and how to look after themselves,
Absolutely. And I find it fascinating. And we've done some research in putting this book together and put out a survey that was appropriate for mothers to do with their daughters. So we encouraged them to sit down and do it together. And the first part of the questionnaire was for the mother and the second part was for the daughter. And then we also asked anyone that maybe didn't have maybe you didn't feel it was appropriate to sit with your mum and do it, or that maybe your auntie or your cousin or whoever. Anyway, point being is that 80% of mothers came back and said they were not satisfied with the information that their daughters were being taught when it came to their sexual and reproductive health at school. I was like, wow, we need this now. The other really concerning statistic that we found through our research was that 30% of young women were Googling information around reproductive and sexual health, which to me indicates that, if you Google anything like that, most often you're finding porn. And this is a big concern I think for us as women, for this next generation, is
massive, especially when we're looking at body image,
absolutely,
and all
but
of that
also
stuff.
Sexual experience. So if their perception of what their first sexual encounter is going to be like is that, they're going to be very sadly disappointed, and also just the pressure that puts on a young girl. So again, let's have this information. Let's talk about it. We touch on things like when should you have sex? When's the right time to have sex? And I think we answered in a great way. I sort of alluded to the fact that, well, sex is supposed to feel really good. And if it's anything other than that, well, it's not time. And if you're going to be nervous, but it shouldn't be nervous in a sense of it being scary. It should be nervous because you're excited. So really just trying to say, if it's not any of these things, should you be having sex? Probably not. Maybe it's not quite time yet, and to think about that. So just those sorts of facts, really gentle. But what I loved the most about the book is I did a whole chapter just Q&A. So I got questions from everybody as to things that they want to know, or things they wish they could ask their doctor, or things that they wish they could have asked their mother, or also teenagers asking them to ask us questions. And that was so much fun to write, because I think that's where we can really create some change, is busting through the myths and misconceptions that we have and really understanding ourselves better.
Have you listened to season 1 of The Shift? If you're enjoying the expert series, you'll love season 1, where we deep dive into the field of gut health with 25 of the world leaders in this area. Head back to your podcast app and find episode 1. It's a great place to start.
The Shift!
So let's have a conversation about contraception in general, but the oral contraceptive pill in particular, and women going on it before they're sexually mature.
Yeah, so one of the most fascinating things I learned in writing this book is that, a young girl's hormones don't really find their way until around 18. And there is this period of time from around 16 that the body really does go through some substantial hormone changes and really mimic what happens with PCOS in the body. It's very normal. It's just a transition. But this is often the time where mothers will be very worried about the changes that they're seeing with their daughter and often whisk them off to the doctor, and the pill is very often prescribed for young girls because A, they haven't had a baby, or B, that they're not completely physically matured. So you wouldn't be looking at an implant or a copper IUD or anything like that. And it wouldn't be appropriate. So the pill is what's mostly prescribed, and also because it can be stopped at any point in time. But if your hormones aren't at a point where they're doing or working in the way that they're quite yet supposed to, because that's a normal body function, then that's a big concern. We don't know the long-term effects of that. We're only starting to see this now. I can speculate what I think that is, but again, it's outside of my realm to talk about. But I would say that we need to be very wary about prescribing the pill to young girls. It's one thing to use the pill for contraception. It's another thing to use it to, and I'll say this in inverted commas, treat a problem. And I'll say this, I can't stress enough that the pill cannot, never has been able to, never will be able to balance your hormones. It does the exact opposite to that in terms of basically flatlining them so they don't do anything at all. And many young girls and mothers are led to believe, unfortunately, that the pill will fix the problem. But it doesn't do that. It's physically impossible for one medication to do that. So I have great concern around that because we know that it upsets the microbiome. We know it disrupts hormone balance. We know it affects the liver, and the long-term effects we're only just starting to see now. What I would be saying is that if you've got concerns because they're hormone imbalance, let's work out what's actually going on. Let's do some exploration. Let's ask some questions. Let's get the facts. Do some bloods, saliva, urine tests, whatever we need to do to actually look at what might be going on. But also, we don't necessarily need to have this shotgun approach. Sometimes it is just the body finding its way first. I get in a lot of trouble for saying young women shouldn't be prescribed the pill. And I would say that I think it's our God-given right to understand how our body works. And if a young woman isn't gifted this, as she matures, it's a disaster for so many reasons. A, your body is telling you something each and every day. B, understand your menstrual cycle. It's so important that we do. It tells us so much about what our hormones are doing. If I can see people's menstrual cycles, I don't need a blood test. I can tell them what's going on based on their signs and symptoms and what's happening throughout the cycle 9 times out of 10. And we can't always know. I'm not saying that it's 100%, but it tells us so much. And if a young woman doesn't have that gift, I see so many women come into the clinic saying, oh my goodness, why has no one ever taught me this? I'm 32, I'm so embarrassed, I didn't even know what ovulation was. And again, also respecting the body and working out when you're fertile and when you're not. And I'm certainly one of those people that I've used that method, fertility awareness, forever. And I have 2 babies, I definitely don't want any more. I know when I'm fertile, I know when I'm not. And how dare anyone insinuate that I'm too stupid to know that? That's basically what we're being told is, oh yeah, but accidents happen. I'm like, not on my watch. So I do get criticised for saying I don't think young women should be on the pill, mostly by mothers saying, well, surely a teen pregnancy is worse than that. And I would ask the question, is it really worse? You don't know the long-term effects. You don't know your own genetic makeup and how that's going to affect you. We don't know that. We know that certain people are able to cope with things better than others. But also, my biggest concern around this is if a young woman is sexually active, she should be using barrier methods because STDs are a massive issue for fertility and long-term health. And if she's 16 and she's having sex, then regardless of whether she's on the pill or not, she really needs to be using the barrier method. And if she's using a barrier method, she doesn't really need to be on the pill. So I just think that there's a bigger conversation that needs to be had, and it doesn't just stop with the pill.
So what's been the biggest shift for you in your life?
Probably Geordie. He's definitely been the biggest shift for me because I've always been a can-do attitude, I guess. But living through the diagnosis that depressive state was something I'd never known before. And that to me was like, am I ever going to feel normal again? And what happens if I never feel normal again? So that was very confronting for me as someone who's generally happy-go-lucky, glasses half full.
Can you think of the moment when you actually made that shift to come out of that?
Yeah, it was definitely on the way to the hospital when I turned to my husband and I said, I think this could be okay. There was a definite moment of maybe it's not terrible. Maybe this is actually the best thing ever. I can't see how that's going to be the case right now, but...
How were you feeling in that moment?
I actually did feel empowered in that moment, definitely, because, again, it's not about control's not the right word, but I think empowered definitely is. It was like I could take the reins on this and I could make it be whatever I wanted it to be. And it's what's so funny is that when you've done that and you've experienced a shift because you've created it, you start to think, oh, well, where else could I do that?
One last question, please. If you could give people just one piece of advice to make a shift in their life, what would it be?
Just start with one thing. We've spoken about so many things, whether it's gut or hormones or liver, and it can be really confronting. And one of the main things I hear often is, I'm so confused. This is online feedback all the time. I'll get people DM me on Instagram saying, I just don't know where to start. Everyone's got a different idea. If you haven't got your nutrition where it needs to be, just start with that. But you might already have that sorted. So it's just one thing. So what is that one thing? And I know that can be difficult to decide on, but just choose one thing, whether it's cutting out gluten or ramping up your nutrition or getting in the practice of finding 3 things you're grateful for before you go to bed. Doesn't matter what it is, just start with one.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There was so much amazing information in this episode, so let's make sure we've gotten the key points and what actions you can take as a result of them. I'm going to summarise some of what Nat said so that you can really understand it. Number 1. We need to understand that there are certain concepts and methods of treatment that are simply not acknowledged or included in the mainstream medical model. This means that we need to look at collaborative care rather than relying solely on conventional medicine to help make us well. The future of health is in collaborative care, and if you can build a team around you, then you're going to be in a much better state to truly heal. Number 2. We need to have more conversations with our daughters about the natural and normal physiology of their reproductive system. This helps to remove the stigma and to normalise normal things like periods and sex so that our daughters can be better equipped to deal with the changes that are going to happen to them during adolescence. Number 3. The oral contraceptive pill is something that we need to talk about more. We also discussed this in episode 25 with Dr. Felice Gersh, and as Nat mentioned, we need to be aware of the long-term effects and weigh up the pros and cons of taking the pill more seriously. Number 4. The outcome of a health crisis can vary so much depending on how you choose to act as a result of it. We need to learn to trust our intuition, and while taking the advice of doctors is important, you need to gather all of the information and take a holistic approach if you want to change the trajectory of your treatment. Knowing is great, but doing is better. Here are 3 things that you can do as a result of this conversation. Number 1, build a support team around you. I know that I talk about this all the time, but it really is so critically important. As well as having great doctors and specialists, make sure that you have other support structures that support healing. This might be natural therapists like acupuncturists, naturopaths or kinesiologists, or emotional support like a great counsellor, hypnotherapist or psychologist. What support do you need to make sure that all of the parts of you are covered, mind, body and spirit? Number 2. Assess your medication carefully and have conversations with your doctors about risk versus benefit. While I'm not saying that you need to stop the pill if you're taking it, you may want to look at the reasons why you're on it, and if there are any other options, do some research and think about how you can reduce your risk overall. This is where a support team comes in, as I mentioned before. Number 3, look at the positives in your situation. It's easy to focus on the negative aspects of your health, but what we focus on tends to come to fruition, so make sure that you celebrate the great things about your health and your life. I loved it how Nat said to look for signs of health. I think we could all take this advice. There was just so much gold in this episode of The Shift, and I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you like this conversation, please share it on socials and tag both myself and Nat Kringoudis so that we know what you think. To learn more about Nat, you can find her on Instagram at Nat Kringoudis or visit her website natkringoudis.com. That's natkringoudis.com. Her book Beautifully You is available through all good bookstores. You can listen to her podcast, The Period Party, and Wellness Collective Radio. And if you're in Melbourne, you should really check out her clinic, The Pagoda Tree, as well. As usual, all links are provided in the show notes. In next week's episode of The Shift, we have an expert series on Dr. Vincent Pedre, an integrative doctor from the US. We talk about why he decided to leave mainstream medicine, all about gut health, microbes, and so much more.
Coming up on The Shift.
How important do you think people's emotional wellness is to their gut health?
It's so key because the gut is our main receiver. I mean, it's our intuitive voice.
So what was it about it that made you lose your way?
I think it's many things. It's the hours. At times I calculated I was working 100 hours a week.
What do you think is a deeper reason that people get sick?
I mean, I think ultimately people get sick first in the mental, emotional realm.
Do you have a question you'd like to see answered? Go to theshiftclinic.com/group, jump in the community and ask us.